Hello, everyone. Welcome to Agora. This is the English podcast version of the Spanish-speaking radio show I do weekly. And joining me on the other end of the line is Ellis Cashmore. Ellis is a university professor, and he has written extensively on the sociology of sports and also of celebrity culture. Hi, Ellis. Welcome.
Hello, Gabriel.
Well, a key question that we're going to address here is, do we pay too much attention to sports? What do you think about that?
Well, sport has never been as big as it is at the moment. I know people would say, well, historically, there has been sports dating back to the pre-Christian times. And the Greeks, of course, created the original Olympics. So there must have been a great popularity surrounding sports. But I don't think there has been any point outside the last 2 or 3 decades where sport has gripped everyone's imagination across the entire planet as it does today. And I wonder, why have we become so preoccupied with sport? Obsessed, you might say. I think it is close to an obsession nowadays. We spend vast amounts of our money, not just on watching sports live, but on our television subscriptions and to travel to and from football games, boxing matches, tennis tournaments. We spend much of our time discussing, debating, and analyzing sports, arguing about sports, fighting over sports, in the case of football, and reading about sport, of course, not simply in our newspapers and magazines, but online. So much of our time is spent on sport. And yet, if we step back and ask ourselves, what is the meaning of all this? We come up with a rather simple answer, and that is, it is literally meaningless. Sport is not going to bring peace on earth. It is not going to help us find a cure for cancer or many of the other great diseases that bedevil all of us. It is not going to save the planet. So it's a pointless activity. I mean, just look at again, next time any of our listeners are looking at a game of football, which is, of course, the biggest sport in the world, ask yourself a question. Here we have 11 men, grown men, mature men, trying to advance a round ball in one direction, while another 11 grown, mature men try to stop them doing that and try to advance the ball in the other direction. And at the end of 90 minutes or so, one of them is declared the winner, or they call it a draw. It is pointless, Gabriel. And yet,
well, but hold on. I wish to interrupt you there. There are many other pointless activities in the world, apparently. Art, religion. I mean, religion doesn't save people from AIDS. Art doesn't cure cancer, and yet there are many books about this subject, and academics don't seem to complain. Why pick on sports?
Well, they pick on sport because I think it's bigger than religion nowadays, and it's probably bigger than art or film or other forms of entertainment nowadays. I think it's eclipsed all these. I am going to separate religion from the others, by the way. I mean, I'm going to argue with you in a second, but let me just put religion in brackets for the moment, because I don't want to upset a group of our listeners who will say that religion is not like football or movies or any other kind of artistic creativity. It is actually a belief system. It is an answer to the ultimate questions that all human beings ask themselves at some time or other. It supplies to us a framework, a way of understanding our existence. I don't think sport does any of these kind of things, but I also agree with you, nor does many other art forms, and nor does certainly not the movies or singing or any of these kind of things. So I'd agree that these are all pointless activities, but I think that there's a difference in sport, because I don't see people rioting in the streets or fighting each other or encouraging their children to be aggressive and attack other children in the name of sport. And that is what we're experiencing at the moment. I'm witnessing this day in, day out. I go to my local park and I see parents pushing their children in a way that suggests to me that the children are not enjoying sport. They're seeing it as an activity that they must do. And I think that we're now in danger. In fact, we're beyond the danger point of risking losing what the whole point of sport was originally about. And I mean that we are meant to enjoy sport. It's meant to bring an activity to our life, which is enriching and an amusement. But you see, Gabriel, I think sport is no longer an amusement. I think it's become a corporate business. And as such, I think its character has changed.
Well, a lot of people say that sports does not encourage violence, but rather stops it. And it's a way of engaging in sort of symbolic violence, but it's better to do it that way than to clash each other with real guns. So, for instance, the Olympics, they are actually made for that. I mean, to achieve world peace, so that two enemies don't handle each other on the battleground, but rather on a soccer field. And during the Cold War, we saw this type of thing between the Soviet Union and the U.S. I mean, I wouldn't go as far as to say that wars were avoided because of sports, but it appears that sports got people together to put down their weapons.
And if you were right, I would agree with you instantly and say, let's all play sport and forget war. But it's a nice theory, but I'm afraid in reality, sport is not an alternative to sport. Sport is not an alternative to war or bloodshed or conflict. In fact, you could say it promotes even more conflict. I've heard this theory many times, and people say, well, if we weren't attacking each other on a football field or on the hockey pitch or on the ice or on a basketball court, then there would be more bloodshed in the world. I'm simply not convinced by this argument. I don't believe there is any evidence for it. And in any case, look around the world at the moment, practically in every continent, there is some form of conflict in which people are destroying each other. Sport has no part to play in all this. If it could bring an end to conflict, I would change my argument in 1 second, but it doesn't. And I just cannot accept that there is any relationship between the two. I think sport goes on, and I think that there is violence and conflict and bloodshed, and lives are lost in sport and out of sport. So I'm simply not seeing a relationship between the two, you see, Gabriel.
Okay, what about Norbert Elias' argument that inasmuch as sports has a lot of rules, this is sort of a civilizing process, and it's actually good for humanity to restrain behavior? Because, I mean, we all have an animal inside us, but sports has a set of rules.
Yes, I agree. I agree. And I think that I accept some of the arguments. I'm not condemning sport outright. Let me put things in perspective here. And if anybody who's listening thinks this guy just does not like sport, let me correct that. I'm a fan. I admit it. I put my hands up. I follow football. I follow boxing. I follow track and field. I follow NFL. I watch too much sport on my own TV. I read too much about sport because I say it's too much because it kind of undermines my own argument. So I can see the attraction of sport. But at the same time, I don't think that just because you enjoy an activity does not mean to say you cannot step backwards and analyze it critically. Now, what Elias was saying is that sport has been a kind of what he called a quest for excitement. In other words, at one stage in our history, there was a lot of fighting, and we lived in a very ungoverned way. When I say ungoverned, I mean without rules, without laws, without guides to our proper conduct. But as we have become part of what he calls the civilizing process, we have learned to abide by rules. We don't need to be told to be good-mannered to each other, to treat each other with respect, and to honor each other in a way. And we do have these unwritten rules, And Elias writes all about them. And he says these are reflected in sport. So actually, sport is very much part of our civilized makeup. And I agree with that. I'm not objecting to Elias. I think it's a good theory. If it meant that we are advancing to a stage when civilization means that we completely banish barbaric behavior to history, then I would love that. I'm no fan of war. I have opposed war for my entire life and will continue to do so until the end of my days. But as I said earlier, I don't think sport has any impact on that.
Now, apart from the fact that sports does take a lot of attention from us and time, can you provide me a couple of examples where you think sports activity is particularly harmful? I mean, because a lot of our listeners may be asking, well, where's the harm? I mean, yes, it takes away a lot of time. It's banal, but where's the harm?
Let me try a couple off the top of my head. One I've just alluded to earlier when I said I can go down my local park, and I live in Birmingham in England, any day and see parents encouraging their kids, not in a joyful way, but in a spiteful way. You know, they intend harm on their opponents, and they're treating their kids like professionals. And it's because, I suppose, they all see their children as the next Cristiano Ronaldo or Lionel Messi, or, you know, they all want their kids to be the next great player. And it won't happen, of course, in all probability. And I think that can be harmful for a child, because the child will get it into his or her head that they are going to be a great player of the future and neglect their other academic work. And so if they neglect their academic work, then it means that they probably we have an expression in Britain, you probably have a similar one in Venezuela, put all our eggs in one basket. It means that you don't keep your options open. You are just become single-mindedly in pursuit of one objective in sport. And I think that can be harmful for a child's development. You asked me for two examples, so I'll give you another one. How about drugs? I think sport initially, and for, say, the first 2/3 of the 20th century, was an entertainment and something that people participated in because they enjoyed it. But as money has taken over, relentless victory, in which don't really count any longer. Everybody who goes into sport today wants to win, and sometimes that means winning at all costs. And so they will take drugs in their effort to gain a competitive edge over their opponents. Now, I'm going to throw in another controversial argument, and I'm not necessarily trying to provoke our listeners, but I'm not against drugs in sport. I think handled safely and brought under control, they do have a place in sport. And it's almost arbitrary, the lines between what is permissible drugs and what is outlawed, forbidden drug in sport. But I think because this is out of control in recent years, a great many of our competitors, whether on track and field, or cycling or swimming, and a great many other sports besides, are taking drugs, which they get from I don't know where, and take them in such dosages that they are harming their own bodies. So that is another negative consequence of sport today.
Right. Regarding the first example, you say that, well, kids who pay too much attention to sports, they neglect their other activities. Now, an argument could be made that in advanced capitalism, 21st century capitalism, we need division of labor. And if these kids are encouraged to specialize in one activity, they will perform it even better. I mean, Adam Smith had that famous argument that when you specialize labor, you make a lot of pins. Now, I mean, what's wrong with professionalizing sports from a very young age?
Because I don't buy this, what I regard as a spurious, that is a false psychological argument. I know psychologists will tell us that if you succeed in one area of activity, then the chances are that you will enhance your chances of success in another. I don't buy that. I've looked at the evidence and I simply am not convinced. if you are good on a football field or in a boxing ring, or you can run quickly around a track and break records, that does not necessarily translate into being good in the classroom and being good at English or mathematics or any of the other subjects in the traditional academic curriculum. I think rather the obvious, the obvious alternative is that nowadays, if you are going to become a world-class track athlete, you have to spend every night training. And that isn't just training for half hour. It's sometimes 3 and 4 hours per night after school. And when you should be, or I shouldn't say should, but could be in a library working on your homework or preparing essays or doing mathematical problems. I simply don't believe that there are enough hours in the day to be able to be good at all things.
Right. Do you think capitalism is to blame for the commercialization of sports during these last 3 decades, and the fact that it's no longer an entertainment but now an obsession?
Well, it's an interesting way of phrasing the question. Is capitalism to blame? Because if we say, well, of course it is, capitalism is to blame for everything, we should also say capitalism is responsible for bringing a great deal of other things into society as well, some of which are quite good.
Right.
I mean, I enjoy watching my television, and I enjoy going to the movies, and I enjoy going to art galleries and museums. And capitalism is to blame for all these kind of things. So, as I say, it's an interesting choice of terms. Obviously, practically the whole world has a capitalist political and economic system nowadays in which there is freedom of choice, a certain form of democracy, and in which people pursue profits. I mean, this is the big thing, profits.
Right.
People like making money. And I suppose if you're going to blame capitalism for that, then I have to agree with you. I mean, in an alternative vision of society, we could say, nobody's interested in material stuff. We don't care about money. We don't want to surround ourselves with commodities, and we don't want products of luxury, and we don't want a comfortable lifestyle. We have now a conception of what we call the good life, in which we surround ourselves with commodities, and those commodities can be bought and sold. There is a price for everything. Now, if this is what you mean by capitalism, then yes, I simply have to say
not only that,
with your argument.
I also meant another thing, that inasmuch as big corporations use sports to advertise, so they put the Nike swoosh on the ball, and they pay huge commercials to Cristiano Ronaldo and Lionel Messi. They are bringing too much attention of society to sports, and they're using sports events as a huge advertising commercial.
Well, in that case, Gabriel, we are to blame. All of us, you, me, all of our listeners, and in fact, every fan in the world is equally to blame, just as much Nike and Adidas and all the big media corporations like Sky and Fox who deliver sport to our television sets. We're all to blame in that sense, because if we were not interested, then that would mean that the media corporations would not be screening sport. And then, in time, the likes of Nike and Coca-Cola and all the other big sponsors of sport would turn away and say, well, we're not making money because nobody's watching the television nowadays, so we'll have to turn to promoting or marketing our products in some other way. So we're the ones to blame.
Right. What reforms would you propose? And let me ask you about one in particular. I mean, you sound as if, correct me if I'm wrong, you're saying that, well, sports has become harmful in some sense because it's being too competitive. Now, back during the Cold War, the Soviets proposed some form of non-competitive sports where perhaps what's important is not to win, but rather to participate, and where a draw would not upset the audience. I mean, if Argentina and England end up 1-1, it's okay. You don't have to go to a penalty kick for a tiebreaker. What sort of reforms would you propose in order to make sports less competitive, less harmful, and so on?
The kind of image of sport that you've just presented there is actually quite close to the original understanding of sport in the late 19th century, where competition was meant to be healthy and beneficial and enjoyable, and the joy was in participating and giving your best, not necessarily winning. There was no great value in winning. The deal was that you got on the field of play, and you tried your best. And if at the end of it you came second or last, you just shook hands with your opponents and you respected each other. So that would be wonderful. But that's changed because we have money. Money has changed the rules completely. When people compete for money, they compete to win because they know the more times they win, the more money they're going to get. And I cannot realistically say to you, we can turn back the clock and say we won't have money in sport. Some sports have always been professional. Soccer, for example, which is big in both our countries. That's always been a professional sport. Baseball has always been professional. So has boxing. Other sports like rugby, for example, and tennis and athletics, they've only become professional in recent years, in the late 20th century. So we can't turn back the clock and say, look, we've got this new thing, it's called sport, and we're all going to enjoy ourselves, but we're going to stay amateurs forever. It's inevitable that somebody will sense, hey, we can make money out of this. People will pay to watch sport. So we can't turn back the clock, Gabriel. The genie's out of the bottle.
But does that mean that we just have to resign ourselves and accept the facts, or can politicians pass a law saying, well, not too much advertising on a game? FIFA could say, well, I mean, if there's a draw, we don't have to break that draw. I mean, I'm sure politicians can do something about it. I mean, you're right that
I don't want politicians doing anything. I don't trust politicians. I don't think that they are capable people.
Well,
I think that they are usually incompetent and quite intellectually limited people. So the last thing I want are politicians messing about in something like this.
But what about
let's remove that one?
What about Joseph Blatter or Michel Platini taking care of these type of things?
Keep Blatter away from things. Keep Blatter. Well, please. No, he's the last person in the world. He's worse than politicians. He's corrupt as well.
Well, I mean, whoever. I'm sure there can be some integral person that can do something.
We don't want to get the program sued, so we have to be careful. But
Right.
Let's put it this way: FIFA, the organization, has been shown time after time, decade after decade, to be one of the most corrupt organizations in the world, and Blatter has been the president of that organization during its period of corruption. So, no, I don't want them dealing with it. I don't think I have a formula or a policy that I can deliver to you right now and saying, this is how I want sport to be in the future. I think there is too much money around. And as you said earlier, we live in a capitalist economy, and while people have the ability to make free choices as to how they spend the money, we cannot stop anybody spending their money, no matter how colossal that expenditure may be. We can't stop them spending their money on their subscriptions to sport on TV, or their admission to games, or on merchandise. And I have to, again, own up. When I get to the United States, one of the first things I do is catch an NFL game. I also like National Hockey League. I watch soccer over here. I watch boxing. I'm a fan as well. I don't want anybody telling me how I should spend my money, or I don't want anybody. I certainly don't want a politician reminding me that I should spend less of my money on sports. So I don't want that interference. So my answer is, I really don't have any kind of recommendation. All I would say is that we occasionally have to remind ourselves that this is a game. This is a trivial pursuit. Trivial, literally quite trivial. There is nothing big turning on the outcome of a game of football or a boxing match. I know there's big money involved, and I know we find it hugely entertaining, but really it is not going to change the world. So worry about things that really do matter in life.
We're about to close the program, but one final thing, Ellis, that you talked a lot about in your books, and I think this is fascinating, the relationship between sports and nationalism. Now, you say that we're paying too much attention to sports, but a lot of people are saying that nationalism may be on the decline, where big multinationals and corporations are taking over. Is this reflected in sports? And I point the case, for instance, of Lionel Messi. He's a great player in Barcelona, a big corporation. But for Argentina, he doesn't seem to be a great player. Now, would this be a positive thing in the sense that if sports helps nationalism on the decline, and we know that nationalism is a very harmful force throughout the 20th century history, could that be a vindication of sports? I mean, the fact that people are less nationalistic?
It's an interesting perspective. And like you, I am an opponent of nationalism. I don't like it. I think it can be very harmful, very aggressive, and it can be punishing on people who are completely innocent. So, no, I'm no great fan of nationalism. And if football or any other sport in some way diminish the importance of nationalism, then I would support you. The problem, as I see it at the moment, is that although Messi may not perform spectacularly well when he's playing for Argentina, and a great many other footballers don't, as they would say in baseball, step up to the plate when it comes to representing their teams, I think the nation's fans do feel quite passionately about their, in particular, football teams or their boxers. And I think that I'm going to use a word now, that belligerence, that aggression, that nastiness that we see revealed in nationalism really rears itself at times of World Cups in particular, not so much at Olympic Games, which usually enjoy a kind of a more beneficial spirit. But in the case of World Cups, I do think we see that nasty side of nationalism.
Well, Ellis Cashmore, thank you so much for taking us our call. Do you have an email or some Twitter account where our listeners can follow you?
I have both. I'll give you my Twitter account, and that is at Ellis Cashmore. Dead simple. ELLISCASHMORE.
All right. Have a great one.
I'll be delighted to hear from our listeners.
Indeed. Bye-bye.